1, 2, 3, okay. The hardware is starting to work. The digestion, I hope you have eaten well, is also starting. So we can now come to our final and what I consider the high point of these 2 days which we have organized for you. When we were thinking already quite a few months ago about the major issues facing the EU, of course everybody thought about populism and how you could actually continue to have an European Union which integrates itself when you have so many parties and people outside who don't believe in this endeavor anymore. And when we were thinking then, reflecting who would be able to enlighten us, then of course the one name that came up immediately was the one of Timothy Garton, who is one of the leading intellectuals of Europe. And he has very graciously accepted. In the meantime, we have had another proof of his standing and of our choice, which was the fact that he has also been the Charlemagne Prize. What is the official title of merits for European integration? You don't.
Charlemagne Prize.
Charlemagne Prize. So I would like to give the floor to Tim. He is a professor at Oxford, I presume, as everybody knows here, on European studies. He's just told me his latest book is Free Speech. And that is, I think, something which he will have right now. Free speech by himself without any visual aids. So it will be a good old school lecture in how to think about European integration or disintegration in the age of populism. Timothy, the floor is yours for however long you need it. Well, and then later we will have hopefully some question and answers involving all of you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniel. This time last week I was in Turkey, over the weekend in Britain, and then via Denmark and Sweden to Hungary, where I got up at 4 o'clock this morning to make it to this event. So if I become more than usually incoherent, please understand the reason. But if you take 3 of those countries, you see rather clearly what a mess we're in. Turkey, tens of thousands of people sacked from the public service, thousands of academics expelled from the universities, more journalists in prison than in any other country. And when you say to people, what can the EU do, they more or less laugh, because they don't think the EU can or maybe will do anything. Hungary, a member state of the EU, is, in my considered opinion, no longer a liberal democracy. It is at best an illiberal democracy, at worst electoral authoritarianism, and yet it continues as a normal member state, and the funds keep flowing from the EU, and its leader, Viktor Orban, is a treasured member of the EPP. And Britain is leaving the European Union in its own very English kind of populism. So that's just 3 glimpses of the mess we're in. Before I go to the diagnosis, let me just say one thing to this room full of great European experts, which is, I would humbly submit that one cannot be an expert on Europe. No one can be an expert on Europe. You can be an expert on the EU. You can be an expert on 1 or 2 or 3 or maybe a group of countries, Scandinavia, the Balkans. You cannot be an expert on 50 very different, internally complicated countries, plus all the international organizations, EU, Council of Europe, OSCE, NATO, which actually make up the European mix. So there are so many particularities to be considered. Danish Euroscepticism is very different from English Euroscepticism, Polish populism from Dutch populism. You remember William Blake said, to particularize is the alone distinction of merit. General knowledges are the knowledges that idiots possess. Well, what I'm going to do today is to be your idiot. I am going to advance a general interpretation, telegraphic style, broad brush, very selective, and allow for the fact that I'm missing out many essential caveats, and I can do three things. First of all, a quick diagnosis of why I think fundamentally we are in this mess, at least some of the main reasons. Secondly, why populists and populism are so effective at collecting the discontents and the discontented that result. And thirdly, briefly, to what is to be done, and then I'll throw it open for free speech. So first of all, how do we get to this place? The day after the Brexit vote, I spontaneously said that the 9th of November 1989, the day of the fall of the Berlin Wall, had been the best day of my political life, and the 23rd of June 2016 was the worst. That was just a personal expression of emotion. But actually, the more interesting point analytically is the extent to which you can trace the roots of today's crises, which in aggregate make up the existential crisis of the European project, to the moment of Europe's greatest triumph, to 1989 and the time around 89. And let me suggest to you quickly 8 causal connections, which arguably, leaving aside all the caveats, can be made back to the moment of our greatest triumph. First of all, from 89, we can date the exponential growth of globalization. Of course, there had been some globalization before, but from 89, the end of the bipolar world, the spread of free market economics, we can date its exponential growth. Although this is a cliche, there is a lot of truth in it, that many of the discontents that populists exploit can be understood as consequences of globalization. I think the important point to make here is that these discontents in the European context are three-dimensional. They're economic, social, and cultural. And it's a combination of those three that make it so difficult to address. Economically, the populists say your job has gone to the immigrants, the bloody foreigners, as they say in England. Actually, it's much more likely that job has gone to India or China as a result of globalization, or to computers and robots. But those jobs have gone, some of them. Real incomes have declined at the margin. And in the terms that Karl Marx popularized, I think it is fair to say, as a simple generalization, that globalization has been much better for capital than for labor, right? Because price reflects scarcity, globalization means there's a huge access of new labor, so the price of labor goes down, not so true of capital. Moreover, globalization has disproportionately rewarded the winners at the top. This brings one to the social component, which is as important. It is not just inequality of wealth and income, although that has significantly increased in countries like Britain and America. There are actually multiple inequalities, and we have to look at them all. Inequality of opportunity, which, for example, in Germany has significantly increased, as elsewhere. That is to say, intergenerational inequality. Inequality of access to healthcare, for example, or education. And inequality of attention. This is a really important point. Those who are seen and represented in the media and those who are not seen, because the populist vote is also a cry of the unseen. Jarosław Kaczynski, rather amusingly, refers to the redistribution of prestige. It's a very odd phrase, but if you think about it, it means something real, which is a lot of people feel they've been undervalued. And that takes you to the cultural dimension, which is particularly difficult to address. The key classic populist line is, I don't recognize my country anymore, because of immigration, because of what is called Islam. But then in East Central Europe, you have Islamophobia without Muslims. And actually, what in Kaczynski's Poland is making the running is not so much the refugees, because you hardly have any, but actually the social liberalization that has come with Europeanization. So issues of gay marriage, gender has become a Polish word, actually much more important, and against that he is reacting. And I think it's important to say that it is as much the speed of change as the direction of change, the sheer speed of change which the turbo effect of globalization has encouraged. Second direct line of causality from 1989, very obviously, direct effect of the end of communism, the Velvet Revolutions, and the fall of the Berlin Wall, is that the countries of East Central Europe make the transition to democracy, and inextricably combined with that, the transition to being member states of the European Union, enjoying the four freedoms of the EU, which are, of course, an intensified form of the freedoms of globalization, and particularly the free movement of people. And did they use it? They certainly did. The roughly, we don't know exactly, 2.2 million East and Central Europeans who came to Britain between 2004 and 2016 are probably the single biggest reason for the Brexit vote. So there's a direct connection to the Brexit vote. Elsewhere, of course, it's more refugees, external migration, but I think the two are connected. The third causal connection can be named very simply in two words: Vladimir Putin. You know, with hindsight, and hindsight is 2020, we were so foolish to believe that an empire that had grown over centuries could softly and suddenly vanish away in the space of just 2 years with hardly a shot fired in anger, and there would be no reaction. A historian worth his or her salt should have seen that that could not be the case. Actually, the mystery is not what Putin is doing now, the seizure of Crimea, making a low-grade war in eastern Ukraine, trying to divide and rule in the rest of the European Union. It is the fact that Mikhail Gorbachev allowed this empire, which had grown over 3 centuries, to be peacefully dissolved. But that is a huge challenge to the European Union, and it is no exaggeration to say that Putin's more or less stated policy is to weaken and divide the European Union, something in which he has not so far absolutely succeeded. I think the sanctions have held well, but he's approaching it from many sides, including, of course, fake news or maybe true news maliciously distributed. Now he's going after Emmanuel Macron, because for obvious reasons he'd rather have Le Pen. The fourth causal connection is, I think, a very interesting one: China. So on the 4th of June 1989, the communist worlds in Europe and China diverged. It was the day of the first semi-free election in Poland, which opened the way to Solidarność coming into government. It was the day of the Tiananmen Square massacre in China. What none of us anticipated at the time was that China would then evolve under the leadership of a soi-disant communist party into a system which might in shorthand be called Leninist capitalism, which has exploited the great opportunities offered by globalization. Now, I don't want to compare this with Putin's Russia because it's a different case, but it is clearly the case that China is pursuing its own interests in the EU. Initially, 10 years ago, they were actually keen to see a more united EU. But they take the EU as they find it, and if it is weak and divided, they will take it weak and divided. And so you have the 16+1 format, China and the East Europeans. You have the new railway plan from the Chinese-owned shipping harbor in Piraeus all the way to Budapest. That's also a challenge for the European Union, although a softer one. Fifth, without question, the euro. Now let me be clear. Of course, the euro has a whole intellectual prehistory and an economic and monetary policy prehistory. But the political decision to go for this eurozone in this form crucially occurs in the weeks and months after the 9th of November 1989. That's not simply a journalistic assertion. I can show it to you in the documents, American, British, and German documents around German unification. Margaret Thatcher foolishly decides to try and stop German unification, like King Canute stopping the incoming tide. François Mitterrand and Julie Andriotta, being much wiser, say, well, we don't like it, but we're going to get something out of it, and they pin Helmut Kohl down to a timetable for European monetary union. And then Helmut Kohl, I simplify, of course, greatly. I can see Daniel is looking worried. Then Helmut Kohl says, well, we need a political union to complement the monetary union, i.e., crucially, a fiscal union. And they say, no, no, no. The idea is we get control of your money, not that you get control of our budgets. And so the founding design flaw of the European monetary union, the Eurozone, is at the moment of birth present monetary union without fiscal union. Moreover, since it is a political project, you have to have Italy and France in there. If Italy is Spain, if Spain, Portugal, if Portugal, the cradle of European civilization, Greece. So you get a Eurozone of such diverse economies that, as we have seen, it is incredibly difficult to make it work. Hence, the new divide in Europe between North and South, the extraordinary suffering in countries like Greece. Whoever you attribute the responsibility to, I think we have to recognize the appalling human suffering in Greek society, something we hope not to see in 21st century Europe. So it's a North-South divide as well as the East-West. Interestingly, the leading article in the Daily Mail, probably the most influential newspaper in British politics, on the 23rd of June, hélas, the 23rd of June 2016, specifically mentioned the travails of the Eurozone and the levels of unemployment in Greece, Portugal, and Spain. So it had a direct impact. These all have cross impacts there. Moreover, and this is my sixth line of causality, it was touched on in the panel before lunch, there was a huge opportunity cost to doing the project of the Eurozone. The EU managed to do two big projects, European Monetary Union and enlargement, chapeau bas, but it couldn't do three. And so the one that was neglected was external policy, common foreign and security policy. And with benefit of hindsight is 2020, I would have argued that we would have done much better to focus on that, on external policy, foreign and security policy, out of which we might have had a more credible response to the Arab Spring, for example, hence to the origins of the refugee crisis, than the over-hasty and ill-designed monetary union. Seventh causal connection, this is an interesting one, the problem of success. I would argue that the biggest single driver of European integration for 3 generations after 1945 was personal memories of war, occupation, Holocaust, Gulag, dictatorships, fascist and communist, defeat, economic misery, and so on. That drove it forward, the motivating force for 3 generations. The shape of the European argument in almost every European country I know was something like this. We have been in a bad place. We wish to get a better one. That better one is called Europe. The bad places were very different. Relative economic decline for Britain, Nazism for Germany, defeat and occupation for France. But the shape of the argument was the same. The problem comes when you've arrived, when you're in it, when you finally got there, as we had after 2004, so that a whole generation has grown up, not having those experiences, to some extent at least taking for granted the extraordinary freedom and peace and relative prosperity we enjoy. Now, you might say, well, hang on a minute, but all the polling shows that young Europeans are more pro-European than older Europeans. True, but is it a great cause for them? Is it a motivating force, as it was for my generation and older generations? My experience is no, and I speak from many years of teaching students from all over Europe at Oxford. In my experience, it's not a great cause for them. It's not exciting. It's nice, but it's somewhat taken for granted. The cause, the passion, comes in people somewhat older, or not quite so young. A BBC reporter reporting on the House of Lords debate about the triggering Article 50 had had a very interesting comment. He said, I quote, "Many peers," that's to say members of the House of Lords, "many peers are of an age when the European Union is central to their political philosophy." It's quite an interesting comment, and I think it captures the truth. It's not central to young Europeans' political philosophy. Moreover, one has to add, if you're the young Greek or Portuguese or Spaniard, like the guy with a master's and D.Phil from Madrid who's a waiter in the Spanish restaurant in Oxford, and many other Spanish and Italian and Greek waiters in Berlin and London, your trajectory is the precise opposite. For you, you were in a much better place in 2004 and 5 when everything looked so good and optimistic, and you've gone to a much worse place, and you feel Europe, the Eurozone, is to blame. My 8th strand of causality is one I'll come back to. Some of you will remember that something else happened in 1989, namely Tim Berners-Lee invented the World Wide Web. I'll come back to that. Now, this takes me to populism. And again, I'm going to be very brief and telegraphic, and I want to identify just a few key features of populism. First of all, it's an obvious statement, but it bears repeating, that there is no internationalist populism. Populism is nationalist. And in the European context, make France great again, make Poland great again, make Hungary great again, or even more cringe-making in Britain, which is, of course, a master of self-congratulation and self-delusion. The Brits just say Britain is great, with the great in capital letters, which makes me want to hide my face. But the same claim is made in all places. Sovereign, national, democratic self-government, often in a strong majoritarian form, is going to give you back something you've lost. And of course, the obverse side of this coin is the perceived failure of Europe-wide democracy, specifically in the European Parliament. Again, not just an assertion. If you look at the Eurobarometer, latest Eurobarometer, the question, do you feel your voice is heard in the European institutions? 55% say no, only 38% say yes. Now, this is not an objective failure of the constitutional arrangements of the European Union, where actually the European Parliament has very significant powers. But the subjective democratic legitimation through the institutions in Brussels is missing almost everywhere. And I have to say, with apologies to anyone who might belong to it, that the political class in Brussels is seen as doubly remote. So the political class nationally is already seen as remote, but that in Brussels, doubly remote. Moreover, and this seems to be an important point, an unintended consequence of the attempt to address the democratic deficit by strengthening institutions in Brussels has been that many of the most knowledgeable and pro-European members of the political class and of the elites altogether have actually gone to Brussels. If you take, let me tell you, 50 of the most knowledgeable and pro-European politicians out of Poland's political class and put them in the European Parliament, that's taken quite a lot away from the national argument about Europe. And I think this effect is seen even in countries as large and significant as Germany. In my personal experience, I would say there was more expertise of and about and knowledge and enthusiasm for the European project in the Bundestag 40 years ago than there is now. And so it's an unintended consequence of developing European institutions. And against that, take back control. Sovereign national democratic self-government is a powerful argument. Second key essential feature of populism, it ventriloquizes the people. I am your voice, says Donald Trump. The people have spoken, say the Brexiteers. Law and Justice in Poland talks about the sovereign being the people. And this alleged direct legitimacy from the people trumps, the verb has acquired a new meaning, trumps all other legitimate sources of political authority in a liberal constitution. Independent courts, the English High Courts say The Article 50 vote must go to Parliament. The Daily Mail says the judges are enemies of the people. Classic piece of populist rhetoric. The same you see elsewhere. Independent media, minority protections, Parliament sometime. The opposite of populism is pluralism. Thirdly, the people turn out to be only part of the people. The people is better translated as the folk. And there are always the others who are not part of the people and who are to blame. And those others are defined ethno-culturally, Muslims, East Europeans in the UK, Sinti and Roma, Mexicans, but also socio-politically. And that's us, the liberal elites, the mass media, the experts. We're also the others. Nigel Farage, on the morning of his Brexit victory, said, this is a victory for ordinary people, decent people, real people. Thus, clearly, I and the 48% who voted to say are neither ordinary nor decent nor even real. Classic populist rhetoric. The last, or penultimate perhaps, feature I want to highlight is this. What skillful populist politicians are doing, and they are skillful politicians, is actually aggregating different social groups which have quite different interests and concerns. And they do this rather skillfully. I might call it, adapting a well-known phrase, coalitions of the unwilling. Everybody who feels in some way left out by the project Europe, the project liberal democracy, the project globalization, how do you bind these groups together, these disparate groups together? Answer by having a powerful, primary colors, simple, emotional nationalist narrative. And that transcends these divides in a sort of wave of warm shared emotion. Final point, and now I come back to Tim Berners-Lee. So as Daniel kindly mentioned, my latest book on which I've been working for the last 10 years is about free speech. Thanks to globalization, available at all good Amazons. Many, many positive developments from the point of view of free speech as a result of the internet, but two negative ones from the point of view of our subject today. Number one, the internet allows an almost an infinity of platforms for different political viewpoints to be expressed. The result of this is fragmentation of the media landscape. What that enables is echo chambers, lies, half-truths, alternative facts, post-fact, fake news or true news maliciously distributed. Everything, all of that plays into the hands of the populist because it enables these echo chamber effects. Secondly, what the internet has done is to blow out of the water the business model of most newspapers, with a few exceptions. Most what are now called legacy media. What do you do if you're drowning and struggling to stay afloat? You wave and you shout. So established media are shouting louder and louder in an attempt to keep their readers and therefore to get the click stream and therefore to keep what they can of the advertising revenue, which is now going hot foot mainly to Facebook and Google. So if it bleeds, it leads. If it roars, it scores. So that our media is shouting, shouting, shouting. Fox shouts from the right, MSNBC shouts from the left. The result of that is that nuanced, dare we say, rational, evidence-based voices get crowded out. So you have echo chamber effects and you have this shouting effect. This is an absolute gift to the populist. Quick example, because it was mentioned earlier, post-fact or fake news. You'll remember that Donald Trump said that Barack Obama was not born in the United States. Whereupon Barack Obama produced his birth certificate. You and I might think that was end of story. Not Donald Trump, who usually says many people think ... In response to Obama's birth certificate, he said the following, I quote, "Many people feel that it's not a proper certificate." Now think about that. I may think this jacket is dark blue, but you feel it's pink. Right? This is a really important point, that you're moving into a kind of different epistemological basis where emotion and feeling, emotional narrative, shared indignation, shared nationalism is more important than any evidence you produce. Quick example from the Brexit campaign. Anand Menon, a wonderful scholar some of you may know, was going around Britain, poor North English post-industrial towns, trying to explain in a neutral, dispassionate, evidence-based way what might happen with Brexit. And he started talking about GDP. And an elderly working-class lady got up and said, "Mr. Professor, you don't understand. That's your GDP. It's not our GDP." It's actually incredibly revealing, right? Yeah, don't bother us with your GDP. So that's a challenge. Now, what is to be done? We have the diagnosis, and the first thing to be done, ladies and gentlemen, and I think Daniel alluded to this earlier, is constantly to be re-examining and questioning and interrogating our own diagnosis. Because if you don't have the diagnosis right, the prescription is never going to be any bloody good. Okay, thoughts for a prescription. I'm going to be super, super brief, really rubric headings, and then, because you know much more than me, and then I'm going to throw it open. So, the first thing that anyone who is liberal with a small l, and I mean really with a small n, right, center, left liberal, and also pro-European has to do, is to say, let's look at those three dimensions of the discontented and try and understand how we can win people back in all three dimensions. And many of these voters, by the way, come from Labour or Social Democrats, the centre-left, so it's a particular challenge for the centre-left. Now, the economic stuff you were talking about earlier in the session on algorithms, that's difficult enough. You actually have to do nothing less, in my view, than rethink the whole world of work, what labour means. Lifetime education, job sharing, maybe basic income. But that's only the start. Then you have the social dimension. I think we need to be much more redistributive, but to look at all those kinds of inequality, not just income inequality and tax. The most difficult part is cultural. How do you find a language of civic patriotism and European patriotism which reaches those populist voters in the echo chambers? So that's the challenge, and you can tell me how we'll do it. Free movement. I think we have to acknowledge that we massively underestimated the risks flowing from both intra-EU and extra-EU movement of people. Certainly Tony Blair did, but I think also Schengen opening the internal frontiers without really securing the external frontier. I do believe that one of the keys here, and I know you have a new paper on a European Coast Guard, is to give people a sense that the governments or the EU or the EU are in control. We did a study at Oxford of immigration and integration in 5 leading Western democracies: US, Canada, France, Germany, and Britain. Canada, of course, wins the gold medal by far. But one of the key reasons why Canada wins the gold medal by far, it's the only one of those 5 countries that really controls and manages its immigration. So it's not just wonderful Canadian multiculturalism, and I think there's a lesson for us there. Russia and China, divide and rule. Will Trump unite us? I think that we have to be just constantly aware that in different ways, certainly Russia, in a softer fashion China, to some extent, possibly in some circumstances, Trump's United States, are looking to divide and rule, are looking to segment Europe. We have to keep our unity, and we have to beef up our foreign and security policy and our defense. I don't, by the way, believe that Trump will be a kind of deus ex machina or diabolus ex machina who'll bring us all together again. The euro, I'll leave for more competent people in the room to discuss, but may I just say briefly that it does seem to me absolutely clear that the Greek debt is unsustainable. The IMF is right, and we better all wake up to that, even if Germany doesn't want to admit it till after the election. And Germany could only benefit from investing more, and Europe would benefit too. Macron-Schulz, the dream team, the grand bargain, reform in France, more flexibility on the Eurozone from Germany would be wonderful. I don't think Schulz is going to win. I wouldn't take a bet on it, but I don't think he's going to win. What is more, I think we are underestimating the danger that Le Pen will actually win against all the conventional wisdom. On the problem of memory, which I identified as one of the fundamental problems, what you have to do is where personal individual memory is failing, you have to try and substitute collective memory. That's what historians are meant to do, and journalists and filmmakers and TV producers and museums. In other words, to learn the lessons from bad experiences without actually having to go through those bad experiences yourself. And so that's a big challenge to us, the historians and the writers. Nationalist, populist appeals for democratic self-government. Two things I would appeal to for this, very briefly. Number one, we're all familiar with this, but no one does much about it. It's not just British politicians. Every national politician comes out of the latest summit in Brussels, celebrates the victories they have won by national toughness and skill, and blames all the bad stuff on Brussels. That has to stop. Secondly, we don't have to make the case for Europe in Brussels. What we are badly missing is people, not just the political class, but intellectuals, think tankers and others, going into our own national context and making the case for Europe in our national languages, our national discourse, our national humor, our national terms. Linton Crosby, David Cameron's political advisor, once said, "You can't fatten a pig on market day." In other words, you've got to do the homework, got to do the preparation, feeding it up. This is what British leaders for 25 years failed to do, which is how we got the Brexit vote. We have to start fattening the pig. The centre-left, as I said, needs to find the emotionally appealing narrative that binds together these substantive points. There's a challenge for journalists specifically, which is to get into those echo chambers and not just establish the facts, because that's not difficult, but it's to get into the echo chambers and tell the story so that people who haven't heard it and don't necessarily want to hear it will actually hear it, and it will speak to their hearts as well as their minds. Those are just a very few fragmentary thoughts. Let me finish with a quotation from Jean-Jacques Rousseau, which I think is particularly relevant to our time. Rousseau said, "To be sane in a world of madmen is itself a kind of madness." So perhaps we can be madly sane together. Thank you.
Of course, while you were speaking, I had many thoughts which crossed my own minds, but I will keep them in reserve for the time being and open the floor. If you can please stand up and give your name and a question.
Rosa Balfour, is it working? From the German Marshall Fund. I would have lots of questions, but I think I'd like to focus just on two in particular. The first is about Britain and the debate, the post-Brexit debate. In particular, I'd like to ask you not about Tony Blair, but about the idea of actually having a movement for Remain. But the other thing which strikes me about the British debate is the fact that both the victory, but also I think the populist rhetoric in general, and therefore that goes beyond the British context, has really narrowed the space for the alternative debate, the other debate, the mainstream debate. So it has actually shaped those contours. So Blair coming out saying, we should fight for Remain has become was a strange idea. And those who believed that perhaps the Brexit vote could be reversed were accused of being delusional. But then on the other hand, you're really limiting the scope for manoeuvre if you want to counter what has happened. So I'd just like your take. Is it realistic to dream of that Britain doesn't leave, if you see what I mean? And then the second question, if I may, sorry, is about Le Pen. I agree that we should think about the possibility that she wins. If she wins, is it game over for the EU, or is that another trap that we've got into? Can we do without France?
Timothy, can I just intervene, because I know there's a second question which is on the Brexit topic. If you could allow me to...
And if maybe there are any others on Brexit, we could take a couple.
Okay, we'll see.
Yeah.
Okay, Graham Bishop. When I walked in, I heard your remark, Britain is leaving the EU. Just following up the comment here, I beg to differ. But this will only happen by a campaign starting soon to fatten the pig, as you put it, and that is beginning. The funding is beginning to come into place. The European movement in the UK, which I'm part of, is beginning to get going. There are the 48% of people, not a small number, who are fizzing with anger about the misleading, I'm not going to say lies, but the misleading campaign. They want these people held to account. That is what we're going to do. And we're going to start the campaign very soon. And as the year and so wears on and the comments about this won't cost you anything begin to become apparent to the British people, I feel strongly there will be a reaction. And therefore, we want to get Parliament to stand up and take control and actually have a further referendum on the terms. And I am confident that that will be won handsomely by Remain.
Right, thank you. The only thing wrong with the excellent speech that Tony Blair made was that it was Tony Blair making it. It is fascinating. It relates to the point about history. The most famous poem in the English language says, "Lithuania, my fatherland, thou art like health. How much we should value you, those alone know who have lost you." And I would like to say EU membership is like health. And how much you should value it, you only find out when you're about to lose it. I have never seen so much pro-Europeanism in Britain in my life. It is absolutely, and seriously, it's absolutely astonishing. I couldn't get into Parliament Square the other day, and I asked the copper what's going on. He said, there's a demo. What's it about? Oh, it's pro-Europe. And there they were, waving European flags in front of Parliament. I mean, unheard of. So, I mean, you're absolutely right. There is this tremendous sense of having been robbed of something which is a valuable part, not just of our interests, but of our identity. However, much as I would like to believe that parliamentary scrutiny could effectively send Theresa May back to get a better deal or to negotiate a day, that's not how it looks to me at the moment, I have to say. And one of the problems is that much as we admire representative democracy, an unelected House of Lords is hardly the world's best example of representative democracy. And the key to my concern is the following. You mentioned as the costs become apparent. Now, my own view is that only if it was apparent to many, many Brexit voters, those who had voted for Brexit, that there was an absolute bloody economic disaster by 2018, could we absolutely revisit it? And at that point, Labour MPs who have now rolled over because 70% of their constituents voted for Brexit might turn. But it doesn't look to me, I mean, never say never, I don't know, I wouldn't also wish it for my country, but it doesn't look to me at the moment as that is what's going to happen. I'm afraid the economic costs will come further down the road when it is already too late. And so I think the best hope for me is that we end up, instead of being 2/3 in, which we are at the moment, being 2/3 out, but with a good transitional arrangement, which maybe endures.
To paraphrase the lady you mentioned earlier, it has to be their GDP. which goes down.
Exactly so. Shall I take Le Pen quickly? I had a weird conversation with someone many of you will know, Jean Pistani-Ferry, not so long ago, when we suddenly were asking ourselves the question, purely hypothetically, you understand, how could President Le Pen trigger Article 50? And it's actually an interesting question, because you then go and read the Constitution, and the answer is the EU is in the Constitution, she needs a constitutional majority, she's not going to get a constitutional majority, so even if she has her referendum, I don't think she'd actually take France out of the EU. So I think it's a different case. So I don't think it's game over for the EU, but obviously it's an absolute earthquake, such as we've never seen before.
There was a question over there. First there.
Francesco Papadia, my question is not specifically on this session, but it's for the entire lab, and it may apply to Daniel as well as to you. A recurrent theme in all the sessions I have attended is we have to fight populism. Populism is a big danger. But the way we fight fights in the liberal world is engaging, is talking, is discussing, is confronting arguments. And I haven't heard anybody here saying we have to talk to these people. Nobody has been invited here from the populist side. What about having you and someone on the populist side discussing and trying to convince each other? I think that would be a better way to fight populism than just preaching to the convert as we are doing.
Daniel.
We did invite populists, and they declined.
There is the chair for the populists.
They were invited, they were invited, but I mean, I think they recognized that they would have a difficult stand. And the kind of arguments they are using don't really, let's say, make contact with the arguments we would be using. I presume you have made the same experience in Brexit debates.
Not necessarily. Actually, there are a lot of very intelligent and interesting British Eurosceptics who you can engage with. But I think the key point, just in my view, is not so much engaging with the populists, the leaders, as engaging with those who have voted for them. And that's what I think we have to do, and find ways of engaging which are more accessible.
Okay, I must admit, we are, of course, at CEPS are engaging more with the elite. Can I make one remark on the causes of populism? First of all, if you look at Europe, and actually if you look at the countries which had the highest increase in inequality, those are actually, over the last 10 years, those are Germany and Spain. They're the countries where the populists are weakest. So I don't know whether populism is about the economically disadvantaged, or it's about those which you mentioned, those who haven't been heard.
Well, inequality is pretty high in Britain, and I can tell you, if you're campaigning for Remain, you sure as hell heard about the inequality. But I accept your point to this degree. For example, in Poland, actually the Gini coefficient is relatively low, but there are different kinds of inequality that we have to look at.
That's what I wanted you to, right? Sorry, there was a question there. Where's the mic? Okay. Why don't you bring it forward, and I'll...
Thank you. Hello, my name is Aleksandra Kluczka. I'm from European Movement International and also a student from Poland. You mentioned that a very important step rather than the euro or enlargement would be the common foreign policy and security or defense, sorry. And while I agree with that, I'm wondering what kind of steps do you envision to happen so it could become a reality? Because many member states, especially those more powerful ones like France, Great Britain until recently, who are even part of Security Council in the UN, or Germany, have their own different interests and might not want to lose their independence there for the common policy. And second of all, even if the member states would be willing to do that, how would we show the direct benefits to the citizens? Because people, as opposed to what some part of establishment thinks, they usually vote rationally, or at least like from the point of view of their best interest, like how in Poland, unfortunately, Kaczynski won, not because we are anti-European, we are still the most Euro-enthusiastic country, according to Eurostat, but they promised a social benefit system that was not proposed by any of the previous neoliberal policies of the 20-something years. So how we can, while having such complex debates about foreign policy or trade, as we saw with the case of TTIP and CETA, how we can actually show the added value for citizens, if there is such. Maybe let's not talk about trade now, but how we can show people that that geopolitical issues can also have a more direct impact on their lives, and that this would be desirable. Thank you.
It's a very good question. Just to be clear, my argument, my counterfactual, would have been to have enlargement and external policy rather than enlargement and the euro, because I think enlargement and external policy are much more clearly complementary and synergistic. And I'm actually a founding member of the European Council on Foreign Relations, which for the last 10 years has been trying to work towards a more coherent European foreign policy. It's been like rowing a boat up a river very rapidly flowing in the other direction. But I do think that there are, although almost by definition, these are slightly more remote things than having 500 zloty in your pocket every month. If you were able to convince the Polish public that actually we had a much stronger stance on Putin's Russia and on Ukraine, that we had kept the solidarity on sanctions because we had a more coherent external policy, that I think would be a helpful argument for you. In Southern Europe, if you could demonstrate that we had addressed some of the causes of the refugee problem in the Middle East and in Africa, I think that would be a pretty effective argument.
Second. You will be next, I think. I wanted to add to that. You were just in Hungary, and I think the same applies to Poland as well. They are supposed to be populists there, but when you ask either Orban or in Poland, the Kaczynskis, they say, okay, the EU has to be reformed, power back to the nation state, comma, and by the way, I think we need a European army. So,
some contradiction. Sure.
Yeah, I mean, what do we want? Are they not the best Europeans? Because few Europeans would actually sign up in Western Europe for a European army.
Yes, I think that there simply are contradictions in their position. And by the way, both of them are very aware how pro-European their public opinion is. So they know that is the background to what they're doing. I'm not sure I would see the Jarosław Kaczynski going full speed ahead for a European army, I must say, because his ideologues, and maybe he himself would have the suspicion that it would be a German army. And what is so peculiar about Kaczynski and PiS is that they have this absolutely anachronistic anti-Germanism, which is very, very deep-rooted. Even though the country's interests are self-evidently in a much closer relationship with Germany. So I think that would militate against your European army.
Yes, Malcolm Harbour. I was a member of the European Parliament for 15 years, so I was one of the people, as you said, who were largely invisible to the British public, who didn't feel that we were representing their interests. And I just wanted to pick up, I mean, I think that's a very accurate diagnosis, and therefore, I mean, everybody here who wants to keep their countries in the European Union, I think, needs to learn strongly from that. And the point you made about Prime Minister's briefing at the end of every council about the advantages that they've secured for their own country was potently made by Enrico Letta in this meeting a year ago. And this is difficult to change, the mindset. So my more positive observation linked to that is that we saw Joe Muscat yesterday. Joe Muscat was a member of my committee in the European Parliament when I was chairman. We may well have other MEPs, and we have had other people who've served as MEPs who've been prime ministers in other European countries. It will never happen in the United Kingdom, but I think that we ought to try and use those, or to build some community of interest. These are the sort of things that the Council should be talking about more energetically. And I just say finally, in response to the point that was made earlier, and you made a very cogent point about diversion of political interest. I agree completely with your analysis about the absolute impossibility of organising or winning another referendum. And I would much rather see, and this is my position, I'm not going to be part of Graham's campaign, and I've told him that, because my energies are going to be try to get the best possible deal based with that internal experience. And I just conclude by linking the two together, but saying, ironically, now, there is more knowledge and awareness in the House of Commons about the power of members of the European Parliament who are going to have a vote on the Brexit deal than there's ever been over my last 15 years.
Yeah.
And I would say also, for people who don't know this, just to show how detached we are, that for the last 10 years, members of the European Parliament from the United Kingdom have never been given security access passes to get into the House of Commons. And now, because of security, it takes longer to get into the House of Commons than it does to go through a security check at my local airport.
Yeah. Can I just say two things? One is, I think Martin Schulz is a very interesting sign. I mean, normally German politicians who went to Brussels didn't come back as top figures in German politics, unlike, say, José Manuel Barroso or Prodi, for example. But Schulz comes back from the very heart of Brussels politics and is amazingly at the moment is very popular. The other thing I did just want quickly to say, because I think this should just be noticed, there was one Conservative MP who voted against Brexit, and that was Ken Clarke. And if you haven't seen it, please watch the YouTube video of his speech. It is absolutely magnificent. This one man standing alone against all the grey men and turncoats sitting behind him with sour faces, making the case for the European Union. It was a great parliamentary moment, but he was only one of him.
Let me come back to the point about the European Parliament and the fact that it's doubly remote. I think we can learn if we look just across the Atlantic. If we look at popular trust in Congress, which is not remote, certainly not doubly remote, it's, I think, lower than the European Parliament. And the trust in European institutions is still, I think, somewhat higher than in national institutions, although the difference has diminished. So there must be something which is common to all advanced Western democracies, Western industrialized countries. The trust in the parliamentary institutions has gone down. Is Europe such an outlier because of its double structure, national, European?
I think it's a particularly intense case. I think it's a massive distrust in and indeed disgust with the political class. And by the way, I don't agree about Congress not being remote, because remember what Trump's rhetoric was. It was all about Washington. We're coming to Washington and we're going to clean out the Augean stables in Washington. So Washington was regarded almost as the Brussels of the United States in that sense. I think there is a particular difference which makes it more intense, which is that politics is also theatre. And in our national politics, we know who the leading players are, and we see the theatre being played out on television night after night, and in American politics too. The European Parliament, I won't say it has no theatre, but it has rather subdued theatre, shall we say, and it's not and it's not played out in our own languages before our eyes.
Yeah, Emanuele Sessa, independent researcher from Italy. Regarding populism, I find it quite inaccurate to say we're not engaging with populists and voters of populists. I mean, I think that demonizing is a very proactive, very active way of engaging, very effective way of engaging, just in negative terms. I mean, if you look at Le Pen, I think that years of French bashing, as they used to call it, at least in France, it's feeding into the Le Pen movement. So my question would be, what are avenues in which we can responsabilize rather than demonize these voters and of populist parties?
Should we take a couple more? Well, I mean, very briefly, because I think I've said what I wanted to say, which is I actually think first you have something real to offer. You need something real to offer to those three-dimensional concerns. You've got to come up with some policies. And then you've got to find a really... So one of the advantages of populists, and this relates to your last point, is that people think they speak like them. They sound like real human beings. So the Trump voter thinks he sounds like the guy on ESPN, in the bar. And actually there was a very interesting study of Trump's language, his actual vocabulary, which showed that 3 or 4 years ago he had the vocabulary of a Wharton School graduate. I mean, as you'd expect. And he had quite deliberately simplified and, if you will, dumbed down his vocabulary with these short sentences, constant repetition, to make it accessible. Same is the trick with Nigel Farage. He just sounds like us. So I think maybe we could start by sounding like ordinary people.
Does it work? Yeah. Okay. I am Luis Cano from Lead Academy, and I am based in Hungary. I'm based in Budapest. And one of the things that we have seen by having several interactions with different actors from the political sphere in Central Eastern Europe has been that in the discussions I have seen the left side of the realm of politics being critical to movements like the Orban movement or the movement in Poland or to Le Pen, to seem a little bit immune to populism. And originally I'm a Venezuelan, so I am myself a survivor of leftist populism. But then I do have the feeling that and you see, like, I use feel because I was raised in populism. But, sorry, I don't know better. But then it's really interesting because one characterization or something that has been a trace, it has been that the populists are the right wing. The populists are identifiable as, right now, as the xenophobic, as the racist. And I don't know how dangerous this is for a future generation or a surgence in the future of actual leftist populism in Europe because of this identification. I mean, can we do something about it to prevent this identification of populists as only right-wing populism?
So to some extent, it's a definitional question. So, for example, Jeremy Corbyn has said that he'd like to do a left-wing populism. So he's using it as a positive term. I would define populism negatively, and therefore I would not advocate a left-wing populism. The problem in post-communist Europe is that at the moment, the left simply cannot get its act together. I mean, there are still elections in Poland. The trouble is that the opposition is hopelessly divided and weak. So never mind the populism, just get your act together, I would say. And of course, there are reasons of that which are path-dependent, which are due with the post-communist history, the fact that you have different kinds of people on the left who find it difficult to coalesce.
One over there. Yeah, go ahead.
Hello, good afternoon. My name is Zoltán Gyéva. I'm a Brussels-based Hungarian correspondent, so Hungarian from Brussels. Here. So, Professor, yes, coming back to this issue of migration, because you didn't mention the migration, but I think so it's a very important moment because it showed the real split between Eastern and Western Europe. And I think so it's quite surprising, perhaps, or perhaps not surprising, to see these gaps which created politically. My question is, because you said, of course, that populism is, from nature, is nationalist. But however, do you think so that there are some features, specificities, related to Western European populism and Eastern European populism? Do you distinguish between them? And secondly, do you think so that, given what you said, that Mr. Tony Blair was perhaps a little bit too optimistic about opening up the labor market of the UK towards Eastern Europeans, that the terms of the enlargement should have been designed in a different way? Thank you.
From MIT. Thank you very much for a very engaging comment. First a comment and then a question. The Trump was a creature of the press. The press made him and put him forward at no cost to himself. And now, of course, the press is the party in opposition. And there's a tremendous blowback in the United States against those very legislators that have voted his policy in. I would like to ask you if you can imagine, I'm going to put you in charge of the Remain effort from this point on. And I'm going to ask you to take into account the following. Can Corbyn be forced to back up? Can he be forced to return to his roots? Do the Liberals have a major role to play in forcing a reconsideration of this issue? Does Scotland have a role to play in terms of really threatening leaving the UK? And since the Brexit vote came upon a veil of ignorance, so much of which has been revealed, you've got to find, I'm going to put you in charge. Tell me what has to happen for Brexit to be annulled. Because Margaret Mead tells us 5% of the population can move a whole nation. That's what she says. So your comments, please.
Take those two. Okay. Yes, I think that free movement should have been handled more cautiously after 2004. And I think that's just a lesson we have to learn. The irony, according to official figures, there are now 900,000 Poles in Britain, which is fairly remarkable. I think that's great for Britain. Our long-term prospects, demographic, economic, they're going to help pay our pensions. It's not so great for Poland. Poland has lost between 2 and 1 million of its young, energetic, well-educated people. I think it could have been handled more cautiously. Not all benefits should have been extended absolutely quickly. In Denmark, there's an amazing example. Students in Denmark pay no fees and get a stipend from the state. So they get living expenses. So now any EU student can come in and gets a stipend paid by the Danish state. The Danish state pays 500 million Danish crowns a year for the living expenses of non-Danish EU students. I mean, that seems to me fairly amazing. So I think it would be handled more carefully, and I think that's a lesson for the left in future. By the time you get to West-East differences, in my view, you actually start then having to subdivide some more. Because I then see the really big differences between the national cases, between Southeastern Europe and East Central Europe, between Poland and the Czech Republic and so on. My advice to Corbyn would not be to back up, but to step down. And in fact, I would argue that, the result of the Brexit referendum was anything but overdetermined. It was anything but inevitable. I think there were about 10 different factors that stacked up, and I would argue if any one of those factors had gone the other way, it might have been 52-48 for Remain. One of those factors was that you had a weak Eurosceptic who didn't make the case from Labour, and it was precisely the Labour voters who most needed convincing. So I hope he'll step down. The Lib Dems are picking up and will continue to pick up because they're an explicitly pro-European party and because liberal conservative small voters in what I call Londonia, which is Greater London defined as 3 hours commuting distance from London, because it's a country, Londonia, will go to the Lib Dems as they did in Richmond Park. I mean, my own fear is that none of that is going to make the difference you want it to make. But if we allow for the following possibility, we don't go over the cliff edge, we get a deal which includes a transitional arrangement for 2, 3, 4 years. Within that time, it is becoming apparent how serious the economic and other costs will be for Britain. Then we have something called a general election in 2020. And I think it's not impossible, although unlikely, that Lib Dems and Labour under a new leader and SNP could go in there, which is basically with a Remain platform. And then we'd have to see what would happen. And a general election in the British system would arguably have the legitimacy to reverse the referendum.
If you allow me one comment on this immigration story, East-West. There really seems to be a British exceptionalism, because most countries on the continent have been quite happy to have the kind of immigration which the UK has had. I mean, in Germany, for example, it's now net immigration before the asylum seekers from Syria and refugees of around 1% of the population, so larger than the UK. But that's not the problem. So I would say really on the continent, freedom of movement of EU citizens is there's really something different in the UK from the continent.
Well, I mean, I think that's right, although I would have to say, Daniel, that I think if you look at some of the rhetoric of the CSU, AfD, it's beginning, it's just beginning to come in at the margin. Yeah.
Thank you. Hello, my name is Tamás Széles, and I'm from Budapest, Hungary. And you've raised quite an interesting point that I've actually wanted to ask a question about. You said that Trump's rhetoric has been dumbed down a great deal from Wharton graduate to the level of the people. And this is what I wanted to add, that we can all agree probably that the EU is not an easy thing. It's quite difficult. The policies of the EU are quite difficult to explain to the people and are quite difficult to actually sell. In your opinion, what would it be, and what would you suggest for example, the political parties, or for example, the EU do in member states in order to be able to translate these complex policies, these complex systems, to the language of the people who actually vote for populist parties? And how can you be more engaged and more active in trying to bring this whole system down to their level in order to be able to perceive all the benefits that they are getting from the EU?
Yes, I'd be a bit careful with saying down to their level. That might sound a little, the haut en bas, literally. I think it's a very difficult one. I think that you're not going to get very far with procedural legitimacy in political science terms, so you have to go for performance legitimacy. You have to show you deliver. The classic example, cheaper mobile roaming fees, that would be an example. One of the difficulties is, if you look at the Eurobarometer polling, the question, what do you most value about the European Union, the top answer, apart from peace, by the way, peace and security, which consistently comes high, is freedom of movement. So what one half of the society most loathes, the populist electorate, the other half most loves. So that's kind of a difficult one. But I would want to look for examples of performance legitimacy, and this is why the Eurozone crisis is really such a cancer eating at the very entrails of the European Union. Because, in the British debate, for example, and in other countries, you could point to the core of Europe and point to its prosperity and growth as well as its quality of life. Now it's more difficult.
Is this on? Yes. Hello, Kurt Bassiner, Democratization Policy Council and University of St. Andrews. I wanted to follow on the last point and some of the other points. Clearly, there seems to be a disconnect that you've discussed between Brussels and citizens of the European Union. I'm wondering whether you could see the way the European Parliament is elected could remediate some of that. Because right now, you don't know who your personal responsible representative is in Brussels, and I'm wondering whether you think that disconnect could be ameliorated, or that's something that you're just going to have to deal at the member state level.
I'll take it.
We have to take one other one in the front row here.
Hello, my name is Tim King. I suppose I'm originally from Londonia, but I've been in this city for a while. I'm a journalist with a sort of fondness for history, and you talked about, interestingly, about memory and the need to substitute collective memory for personal memory. What examples or histories would you offer, or memories, of a successful combating of populism that didn't involve war?
You mean a combating populism didn't involve... Oh, right, okay. I think Enoch Powell didn't do very well with his Rivers of Blood speech. The truly racist, xenophobic language, which was really very widespread in Britain in the 1950s and 1960s has virtually, not entirely, but virtually disappeared by a conscious effort of almost everybody in public life. And I think that's important. It's not just politicians. It's all the opinion formers. It's sports people. Yes, it's David Beckham as much as it's David Cameron, and journalists and the way journalism is done. So I think that would be one that came immediately to mind. To the question on the European Parliament, I'm afraid the short answer is no. Now, don't get me wrong. I don't mean that it's not worth thinking about that, but we have a very big immediate problem, right? And I think you have to find things that start addressing the immediate problems, and I think that's going to be performance legitimacy plus some attractive, emotionally appealing language rather than some procedural tweak to the European Parliament.
Okay, I think we have the last two questions over there. One and one.
Sebastian Kurpas from European Commission from CEPS. Very brief question. How would you see the potential benefits or dangers of adding more flexibility to the current EU setup? On the one hand, making the system unquestionably even more complex than it already is. On the other hand, possibly addressing more, giving the possibility to more address certain national or other fears about a certain part of integration.
Right.
I'm Massimiliano Mascherini from Eurofound. There is a sentence that I heard several times in these 2 days, that is too little, too late. And in some sense also this phenomenon seems to emerge from this too little, too late. In 2011 we wrote a report on youth employment, and I presented at the European Parliament highlighting that in South European countries the youth unemployment seems to take a political connotations. But young people who were unemployed didn't identify themselves with any of the political parties that was present in the parliament. And after 3 years, we had the explosion of the five-star movement in Italy. But when I presented this, I received a comment from one of the parliamentarians saying, well, man, you got it wrong. I mean, young people stay on the sofa. They don't participate. But then the things went differently. So maybe the European Parliament is perceived as far, but maybe it is, as sometimes the national parliament, a bit detached with the real sentiment of people. But conversely, from a previous question, my question is then, sometimes these movements are as core populist, but they are sending fascist messages. So in order to fight them, should we call them as they are, neo-fascist or fascist? Thank you.
Okay. I think one thing we have to do is to recognize just how complex and flexible the EU already is. The way we talk about the EU doesn't reflect the complex variable geometry it already has. I would be very worried about even more have your cake and eat it. The famous Boris Johnson doctrine, my attitude to cake is to have it and to eat it. I don't think that Britain should have its cake and eat it. I actually think it's rather important that Viktor Orban and Jaroslaw Kaczynski don't have their cake and eat it, because they're the people who are really having their cake and eating it, having all the benefits of EU membership without any of the obligations. So to some extent, I would actually rather reconnect the values-based democracy, human rights side of the European project to the economic and social. Youth unemployment and all of that. I mean, first of all, I do think we have to say, in a country like Spain, it is amazing how well the centre held. I mean, that really is a tribute to a certain quality of civil society in Spain, to the rootedness of the commitment to democracy and to Europe, that you went through so much pain without having anything that could really be described as rabid xenophobic populism, and very little scapegoating of the significant Muslim population. So that's the good news. I think we should be extremely cautious in using the word fascist. I don't know about you, but I remember from my student days that everybody was a fascist. So I think we have to be very careful. My own view is that just on a calm analytical analysis, Vladimir Putin's regime is pretty close to something one might call fascist. And Recep Tayyip Erdogan's regime in Turkey is, I would say, electoral authoritarianism, but in danger of going that way. But I would use it cautiously. Last quick point, if I may. I think we have to acknowledge, we talked about liberals fighting, but liberals also have to be self-critical. And I think we have to acknowledge that we did, all of us, to some degree, live inside a sort of Whig interpretation of history. So all this stuff that went wrong, we thought it was that went wrong, and that went wrong, and there was Bosnia, and there was Ukraine, and there were refugees, and there was the Eurozone. Somehow they were exceptions, accidents along the road, but we were on the high road. And I think now it is clear enough that there is some really major counter wave coming, not just against the European project, but also against the project of liberal democracy and open societies. And we have to face up to that. So that I think that's also an important paradigm shift. But I don't think that needs us to be calling everybody fascist.
I think we have to draw it to an end, but I cannot let you go without your parting thoughts on the two issues that we discussed: populism and European integration. So if you think about the next decade or so, your view, have we seen the high point of populism, or is there still more to come in a 10-year perspective? And do you think the European Union as a construction will actually withstand it and integrate? Or will there be a process of, say, maybe not catastrophic disintegration, but something which brings the entire process to a halt?
A great historian, Hugh Trevor Roper, once nicely said, "History is full of surprises, and nobody is more surprised by them than historians." And that has to be said up front, so I don't know. In my bones, I feel that we have not seen the last or maybe even the highest of the populist wave. I just feel that as one looks at it in a historical perspective, big waves like this take time to, as it were, to wash their way out, to come ashore, and for the opposing forces to regroup and gather strength and respond to them. That's why I'm so worried about France in particular. So the answer to that one is I think it's going to be with us for some years to come. The answer to the European Union is that I'm sort of a bit tired of all these apocalyptic stories about how, the European Union is going to end tomorrow. But what I have always felt is the more realistic danger for the European Union is that it won't collapse like the Roman Empire, but it will fade away like the Holy Roman Empire, which lasted, as you will recall, for decades and indeed for centuries, with all the institutions and the Kurfürsten and all the ceremony, but with the institutions gradually being hollowed out while the real politics were played out elsewhere, and Germany actually had its national policy towards China and Russia, and Britain its, and France and so on. And I think it's the Holy Roman Empire we have to watch out for.
Watch out for or expect?
Well, I mean, I would not like to see us, the project of European Union, in which I passionately believe, and which I believe is so important not just for us in light of our history, but also because it is by far the most example of liberal international order anywhere in the world, and therefore the future of liberal international order also depends on it. So I don't want it to fade away like the Holy Roman Empire, which, as you remember, I think it was Gibbon who said was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire.
Okay, on these words we conclude. Thank you very much.